Welcome back to History Now. Today's show, I'm delighted to welcome Brian Costello, who's the grandson of Major Michael Joe Costello. Brian, welcome to the show. Can you, for our viewers who probably aren't familiar with who he is, can you tell us who he is and not what he did in Irish history, but just who he was?
Thanks, Barry. I'm glad to be here. Michael Joseph Costello was my grandfather. He was born in Cloughjordan, County Tipperary in 1904. So his early life, I suppose, he became a member of the Volunteers and fought in the War of Independence, or the Anglo-Irish War, as he called it. Later fought in the Civil War on the pro-treaty side, and remained on in the National Army until the end of the Second World War, where he was in charge of basically the entire southern coastline from Waterford around to Galway during the Second World War. He was in command of that area, 20,000 troops under him.
Yeah, so you mentioned he was born in Cloughjordan, County Tipperary. Mm-hmm. Probably people are familiar with that because of Thomas McDonald. Yeah. McDonald was actually your grandfather's godfather.
That's right. McDonald and my great-grandfather, the General's father, Dennis Costello, were close friends. My grandfather, he had lots of memories of McDonald from his childhood. McDonald was viewed by the people in Cloughjordan as something of an eccentric and had little or no friends in his native village apart from Dennis Costello. McDonald was teaching in Kilkenny, I think around 1901, at the time that Dennis moved to Cloughjordan to become the local teacher, and discovered he was a late convert to the Irish language and became a member of the Gaelic League as such. And I suspect then on his returns to Cloughjordan over the summer holidays and weekends, etc., to see his mother, who still lived there, he struck up a friendship with Dennis, who was a native Irish speaker from County Clare and a passionate Gaelic League enthusiast, used to cycle all around North Tipperary teaching Irish, etc. So they became close friends, and my grandfather remembered with some disappointment when McDonald would call to the Costello home in Cloughjordan after the early pleasantries and the introductions. Dennis and McDonald would spirit themselves off to a room at the end of the house to learn Irish and practice Irish and so on. So my grandfather always said that most of McDonald's Irish he would have derived from Dennis, and Dennis encouraged McDonald to go to the Gaeltacht and so on during the summer holidays, etc.
So he was pretty influential in the cultural nationalist side of.
He would have been, at that stage with someone like McDonald, yeah.
Everybody knows Thomas MacDonagh as one of the signatories to the Proclamation of Independence and his role in 1916. Also a poet, and one of his last published poems was The Man Upright. That's right. Which was about your great-grandfather.
About Dennis Costello, that's right. A poem that, in my grandfather's words, did nothing to enhance the popularity of either man amongst the residents of Cloughjordan, because in rather frustrated tones, MacDonald describes the villagers and the farmers and the business community of Cloughjordan as kind of been seemingly to be content with their subjugated condition under British rule, and they were just had their head down, focusing on their own little world, rather selfishly, maybe, as he said, hoarding pence in a till, not lifting their head up and looking at the bigger picture. And he described his neighbours as such in rather disparaging tones, but then that they were all crooked and bent over their work. And he says in the poem, he thought that the only thing straight in the place was the steeple. But he continues then, there came a man of a different gait, a man who neither slouched nor pattered, but planted his steps as if each step mattered. And that was the contrast to what he'd previously described. That was Dennis Costello, my great-grandfather, who he observed from his window, marching upright straight down the street. So you can take from that I suppose he viewed Dennis as someone who was independent. He wasn't allowing himself to be subjugated by anybody. He was an independent thinker. He was prepared to stick his shoulders up and march down the street. So it's a whole lot of other kind of a lot of imagery comes forward in that, with what happened subsequently in the Rising, in terms of where a minority of independent thinkers decided, for better or worse, that they were going to show the majority that there was a better way,
Yeah. Cloughjordan changed rapidly in those years. 1916 itself, your grandfather would have been 12.
He was 12 that summer, shortly after the Rising, yeah.
And you have some information on how he viewed the Rising and what in the aftermath?
That's it. Obviously, with the McDonagh connection, it would have resonated in their household in particular. He described, how the reaction amongst the people of Cloughjordan was they threw their eyes to heaven and said, well, sure, we always knew McDonagh was mad. And it wasn't unique to Cloughjordan, but there was widespread condemnation of the rising and the destruction and so on, the loss of life. But gradually, once the executions had taken place and some influential members of the clergy, there was Father Pat Gaynor in North Tipperary and the Bishop of Killaloe, Dr. Fogarty, etc. They began to maybe espouse the Sinn Féin outlook that the attitude that prevailed, that McDonagh was mad, slowly began to change. And by the end of 1917, that change in attitude was complete to the effect that McDonagh was a hero in Cloughjordan. And in the meantime, obviously, De Valera had won the East Clare election, which was geographically not too far away. So my grandfather witnessed that as a young child, I suppose. He witnessed that metamorphosis. And he described the 1916 Rising as a watershed moment in his young life, where before that he was engaged in all the childhood pursuits and hurling and etc. But as all his generation did, they kind of grew up rapidly. So the Rising was kind of the first step to adulthood for him, You
had mentioned previously about when the prisoners were released, a march taking place in Cloughjordan that your grandfather...
Yeah, he was in charge of the local Fianna boys, which was kind of like a Boy Scout wing of the Irish Volunteers. So he was in command of those in Cloughjordan because he was considered too young to be a member of the Volunteers. So he was in command of a group of Fianna boys who staged a welcome at the railway station in Cloughjordan when prisoners were returned from Belfast jail. And he described it that was a very proud moment in his young life. He felt he was taking part in something historic,
Yeah, and so we move on a couple of years. The War of Independence, like many places around, particular South Tipperary, the likes of Dan Breen and Sean Tracy and all on operation. But in North Tipperary, not too far away, there were incidents happening in and around Cloughjordan, and one of them involved the Black and Tans arresting your great-grandfather, Dennis. Yeah,
they arrested Dennis. Dennis wasn't a member of the Volunteers, but he would have been, as we probably alluded to in reference to the poem, The Man Upright. Dennis was outspoken. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind. He was very active in the Gaelic League. He was trying to teach his own pupils in the school Irish, which would have been frowned upon, if not illegal. So he would have very quickly brought himself to the attention of the local RIC. He had been previously arrested in 1919 for making a speech of some description, I think, in Borriscane, and he was detained overnight. So he was always possibly on their radar. And in December, I think it was the 8th of December 1920, which was shortly after, a couple of weeks after Bloody Sunday, people like Dennis, who were kind of on the periphery of the volunteer movement, but were exerting a nationalistic influence on the community, were largely rounded up. So it wouldn't have been unusual for someone like him. So he was brought, I think, initially to Limerick prison, Spike Island, and ultimately on the 29th of December he came to Ballykinler in County Down, where he was interned until the truce.
And so that had a huge impact on your grandfather?
Huge impact. He was the eldest of 9, so there was a large family. The breadwinner was gone. So what it triggered in him was he had been, up to that point, he had been doing a lot of low-key intelligence work for the 2nd Battalion in North Tipperary, but he became a full-time active volunteer at that stage. Left school, he had been in school in Nina, in the CBS, and he also got a small reporting job with the Midland Tribune, which he was unfortunately sacked from within a few weeks for. He discovered he could send in reports of the local Board of Guardians meetings without having to attend. So I'm not sure how long he was getting away with this, but he sent in his report as usual without going to the meeting, and unfortunately the Black and Tans broke up the meeting, which the news of that did reach the editor of the Midland Tribune, along with my grandfather's report of the successful meeting. So at that stage, that was the end of his journalistic career, although he was a prolific writer later years. And
so that intelligence work carried on in the War of Independence, didn't it?
at the time of the truce in July 21, he was the intelligence officer for the 2nd Battalion in North Tipperary. So he wasn't yet 17 years of age, but it was a pretty responsible job. So he would have helped collate and collect all the intelligence that led to the Mudrini ambush outside Cloughjordan and other various instances. He was involved in a robbery on the mail train, which were actually intercepting the mail carts that were bringing the mail to the railway station in Cloughjordan. So he's involved in intercepting a lot of that. So they got a lot of information in that way, you know. So he modestly, I suppose, said that his skill for intelligence was more so. He was good at collating various bits and pieces of information and piecing it all together. And being the son of the local schoolmaster, he also had a prolificacy for being able to write reports, which wouldn't have been common, I suppose, at that age. So because he was willing and able to write up reports, he got promoted pretty rapidly in the intelligence field.
Yeah, and this ultimately led him onto Michael Collins' radar, didn't it?
It did some years later, yeah. Having supported the treaty and joined the National Army, he was posted to Portlaoise in County Laois, and he early on at the end of July, so early in the Civil War, there was an incident outside Portlaoise near Abbeyleix that where 2 senior officers were killed in a rounding up operation after an ambush, and my grandfather, a third chap, another Tipperary man, was injured, and the other 2 were my grandfather and a private. They succeeded in forcing the surrender of the 23 anti-treaty IRA volunteers. They tricked them into believing that they were surrounded when in fact they weren't, so they all dropped their weapons and came out. So the backup came in due course, and they were all captured and put in jail. But that was on a Friday night. Collins coincidentally happened to be coming to Portlaoise on the Sunday, and he got wind of this particular episode. Obviously, there was a couple of vacancies now in the command structure with a senior officer having been killed, and he personally he sought out my grandfather, got a report of what had happened, and that was the kind of thing that impressed Collins, of this young 18-year-old, shown the quick thinking and the presence of mind under fire as such. So he promoted him to intelligence officer of the 3rd Southern Command, as it was at the time.
When the truce was called and the treaty, your grandfather, as you said, took the pro-treaty side?
He did, yeah.
Yeah. Is there any sort of insight into his thinking?
Yeah, he gave numerous interviews in print and on in audio and TV on that, and he even 60 years later, he was very clear as to why he chose the pro-treaty side. A couple of years previous, the volunteers were all asked to take an oath of allegiance to Dáil Éireann. So he took that oath without any difficulty. I think it was probably in 1920 when he became a full-time volunteer. So as far as he understood, when the Dáil approved the treaty in January 22, he was oath-bound to, he felt oath-bound to go along with that. That if the Dáil were satisfied to approve the treaty, that was a matter for the Dáil, and him just being a humble volunteer had no authority to dispute that. The second point he made was that if someone chose to have the authority themselves to repudiate the Dáil, who was to say that they also were wrong, and someone would come along and then disagree with those, and then you led to a state of anarchy in the country, which actually developed for a period. So he maintained that position all his life, that he subsequently took part in the Civil War to establish a democracy in Ireland and to make sure that the will of the people was enforced. So the treaty was subsequently endorsed at a general election in June 22, and again the following year, again in 23, there was another general election. So he, all his life, was a Democrat and a public servant, and the will of the people always must prevail.
Yeah. And once the treaty's been ratified and established, your grandfather's still a very young man. Yeah.
So I mean, as I say, he was promoted in the 1st of August 22. He was only just after his 18th birthday. There's evidence in the Mulcahy papers of Diarmuid O'Hegarty, who was Director of Intelligence of the National Army through the summer of 22, recognising the then Colonel Commandant Costello's flair for intelligence work. And it was no surprise then that I think in January 23, when the 3rd Southern Command was being disbanded, O'Hegarty wrote to my grandfather's superior officer in Athlone, was the command headquarters at the time, seeking his transfer to Dublin, to GHQ. So O'Hegarty brought him to Dublin. He was only 18 and a half. So he moved to Dublin in February 23 as Assistant Director of Intelligence. And by the following October, he held the post in his own right. Not long after his 19th birthday, he was Director of Intelligence of the National Army. So it was put to him that was an amazing appointment for someone so young, but as he said himself, Collins had been very young, and there was an awful lot of young people in positions of authority at the time due to the state of things in the country, and people had to grow up fast. So it wasn't unique by any means,
Yeah. So your grandfather only met Michael Collins twice?
I think twice, in quick succession.
And he did a lot of interviews towards his later life.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the later life, he said in those 2 meetings, Collins made such an impression upon him.
Made a huge impression, and even been asked about those encounters 60 years later. You could see and hear my grandfather becoming animated by it, and he said through his subsequent military and business career, he met an awful lot of people with big reputations internationally. He met 2 or 3 presidents of the United States, for example, and so on. But he'd never met anyone who could command a room or with the same charisma that Collins had. No, he was only 18 when he met Collins, and there was possibly somewhat starstruck. So you have to take that into account. But Collins, he said, had time for everyone in the room. He gave, I suppose in my grandfather's case, he gave him his 100% attention and focus for the few minutes he was talking to him to extract as much information out of him as possible. Moved on to the next person, thoroughly cross-examined them, got everything out of them, all the while marching up and down the room, eating a sandwich, and then breezed out and left the room wondering, well, what was that that breezed through here? So and he had that, I suppose, devotion to Collins then all his life.
If you go on to your grandfather's time as head of intelligence, he did go off to America at one point, but before I mention that, bit of information that you got quite recently from the Bureau of Military History about your grandfather's insistence on keeping records. Exactly,
as early as 1924, there's records in the military archives where he proposed to the then chief of staff that they ought to establish some form of military archive. The military archives now is a national treasure, and almost on a monthly basis they're revealing more and more by way of the pension statements at the moment, which are educating all of us in a way that we never thought possible. But he would have, my grandfather proposed initially in 1924 that some kind of archive would be established, because he was in GHQ at this stage in Parkgate Street in Dublin, and there was rooms there filling up with boxes and boxes of papers dating back covering the period of the Rising, the War of Independence, Civil War, etc. And as I saw quoted, nobody seemed to know what to do with all these, and in that vacuum they could easily be destroyed or certainly fall into disrepair. So there was a junior officer then appointed to watch over these papers and look after them, and thankfully I think they were moved all around the country. I think they were in Galway for a couple of decades, but thankfully now they've found a home and they're open to the public in military archives, which is fantastic. So that would have happened anyway, Barry, I'm sure, but it's nice to know that he was a keen historian himself and read widely in history. So he always had, even at that young age, an eye for preserving the record for future generations.
When he goes to the United States, it's not a holiday by any means.
No, not far from it. Yeah.
But if you can tell us about that, but also when he was there, he meets with someone who, for decades had shaped nationalism in Ireland.
Thinking, and exactly.
John Devoy.
John Devoy, yeah. The trip to the States was an attempt by the government and the Free State Army to ultimately they wanted to establish a military training in Ireland, in the post-Civil War period. So the military college was the ultimate outcome of the trip. So the military mission, there were 6 officers went to the States in the autumn, summer autumn of 1926. So my grandfather and Major General Hugo McNeill went to the Command and Staff School in Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. And I have the class photograph, and the most striking thing of it, there's 207 officers in it. 205 of them are middle-aged, in their 40s, veterans many of them veterans of the First World War. And you can spot the 2 young Irish officers, 22 and 26, stuck in the middle of these. So it was a remarkable position to find themselves at that young age. A pretty grueling 9-month course in Kansas, followed by a few months serving then in units of the American, and in my grandfather's case in the Canadian Army. So towards the end of that trip then he had several conversations with John Devoy in New York, and Devoy would have been an old man at this stage. I think he died within a couple of years of that. So I unfortunately I don't have any record yet of those conversations or the impact they would have had on my grandfather, but he would have grown up, for him as a child, Devoy would have been something of a hero figure. So it must have been a great thrill for him to meet him, and also, I suppose, to give Devoy a first-hand account of what had developed in Ireland over the previous few years,
Okay. So you mentioned the area of command that he was responsible for when you got to World War II or the emergency. After this, though, leaving behind the military life, your grandfather had another life, really, another completely successful career.
That's right.
Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, he'd been thinking of leaving the army before the war, and then when the war broke out, he felt obliged to stay on, so he did so. But as soon as the war was over in 1945, he was approached to see would he become general manager of the Irish Sugar Company, a position that had been vacant for some time. And the reason he was approached, I think, was mostly from a human resource. What was now human resources wasn't a term used back then, but what we now describe as human resources. I think the sugar company had been averaging three strikes a year, and there was an awful lot of
for 20 years or something.
Something like that. An awful lot of management issues in the company. So they thought by bringing in some military order into the organisation that they might be able to rectify that. There was a strike when he arrived. There very quickly was another strike shortly after he began to change things in there, which finished in 1946. But there wasn't another strike there in the following 20 years up to the time he left in 1966. Mm-hmm. And one of the main reasons for this was, and this has been widely acknowledged throughout Irish business, he brought in workers' committees and safety committees in the sugar company, made it a very democratic organisation. So the person sweeping the factory floor could have a say about the type of work they were doing and the conditions they were working, and that could be passed right up along to management. So that was all brought in. Legislation provided for all that some decades later, but they had it there long before. So that created a very harmonious place to work, and people had a great pride in the work. And he would have seen his role in the sugar company as being almost a vocation and a natural follow-on from his participation in the Anglo-Irish War and the Civil War. He felt he was duty-bound to try and motivate and encourage the farmers, in this case, in the growers, people who grew the sugar beet for the sugar company, to do their best for the national spirit and build up this into a big national concern, Irish Sugar, later Éireann Foods. He was a practical patriot in that regard. His patriotism didn't finish at the truce or at the end of the Civil War when he left military life. He was a practical patriot till the day he died, I suppose. Yeah,
and he's partly responsible, we found out a few days ago, for the first computer.
That's right.
In Ireland,
he was. His time in the sugar company. There's lots of different milestones, lots of different firsts. I alluded to the workers' committees and safety committees. But I think in 1957 they imported the first, what was then known as an artificial brain, but what we now know as the first computer into Ireland in 1957, and it was installed in Thurles. I think it weighed 4 ton, and it took an army of men to bring it over from the UK and to install it. But that was typical enough. He he organised a grant from the sugar company to establish the Department of Genetics in Trinity College, so that they could start breeding better seed varieties of sugar beet and later other crops that would be resistant to disease and be more useful and suitable for Irish conditions. The Department of Genetics is obviously still on the go in Trinity, so that, you know, there was wider benefits to a lot of these things that he brought in. You know, he certainly was never afraid to innovate or and you hark back to his father marching up the street in Cloughjordan. He was never afraid to stand out from the crowd and be the innovator and be the first to do anything. In fact, he saw that as his duty.
Yeah. When he'd left the military side behind, that didn't mean he'd left everyone who was part of that behind. He did have a rapport with people on both sides of the treaty.
Absolutely,
split
yeah.
in the later years of his life.
Yeah, and he continued to speak and write on military matters right up to his death. But from the early days, he was a very active member of the 1916 21 Club, which was an organisation that was put together to try and reunite former comrades who would have parted during the Civil War split. And even before that, Barry, one quite remarkable aspect of his command in Cork during the Second World War was the amount of anti-treaty people who he brought in to the army in very significant positions. Tom Barry was a huge ally of his in the Second World War in Cork. Liam Deasy, Florrie O'Donoghue, although Florrie remained neutral, I think, during the Civil War, but Florrie became the intelligence officer for the 1st Southern Division of the Irish Army during the Second World War. And my granddad always said that, in fact, the emergency in the Second World War probably helped heal the divide of the Civil War quicker than it otherwise would have happened, because all of a sudden there was a common threat to the country, and people left previous divisions behind them and all came together to try and set up some kind of defence structure in the country that would make us unattractive to invasion, you know.
Yeah.
So that the emergency kind of helped accelerate the healing of those wounds, you know.
Yeah. So you've amassed some things of your grandfather's throughout to get a better picture of him, and I'm sure that's going to intensify in the years to come when we're celebrating the centenary of the Civil War and things like that.
Absolutely.
I know a lot of researchers and historians would watch this programme. If someone happens to come across anything of your grandfather's or any speeches, things like that, is there somewhere they can get in contact with you?
Yeah, I'm sure they could get in contact with yourself, Barry, through the programme. And people, it's funny, people are very good. It's amazing, both my dad, when he was alive, and myself, the amount of stuff that has come our way just when people know that you're interested. And I've enjoyed over the last number of years meeting they're all very old now, but people who would have worked with my grandfather worked under him in the sugar company and Dairy and Foods, and hearing their recollections at first hand of the atmosphere that he created in the place. He said it was like a university, and they'd think nothing of staying on late and working overtime because they were motivated by a sense of national pride that they were doing something good for Ireland, and it wasn't a job for them, it was a vocation, you know.
Brian, as you say, anybody who wants to contact the show can contact me. I can certainly pass on anything that comes our way. But Brian, thanks very much for coming in.
You're very welcome, Barry. Enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Yeah.